Good evening. Several senior Conservatives have urged the Prime Minister to use the departure of his chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, to reset government. Mr Cummings walked out of Downing Street last night after the resignation of another senior figure, the Director of Communications, Lee Kane. The former Brexit Secretary, David Davis, told the BBC that ministers are now hoping for more of a say in how the country is governed. A warning: this report from our political correspondent Nick Eardley contains flashing images.
The Dominic Cummings era in government is coming to an end. Boris Johnson wants to clear the air in Downing Street, and that means his chief aide, seen here this morning leaving home, won't be returning to number 10. The way this place works matters to us all, to how decisions are made, to the direction of policy. After the very high-profile departures of recent days and some of the drama inside, some Tories are hoping for a change.
It does give the government a chance to reset all sorts of things: its relationship with Parliament, the way it deals with the press. And many of the failures of the last 9 months have not been Mr Cummings' fault, they've been intrinsic in the system.
There have been many unhappy Tory MPs in recent months, angry at high-profile U-turns, worried the Prime Minister wasn't listening to them. One of them told me changes in the top team would be important.
It's going to make an enormous difference. Over the past year, there has been a significant and growing gap between the number 10 operation and the parliamentary party. We're enormously fond of him, and we felt we were losing him. And some colleagues felt that he'd been lost altogether. But now we're looking forward to marching in lockstep alongside our Prime Minister.
This is the Prime Minister last night with another key aide, Lee Kane. Mr Kane quit after a power struggle over whether he'd be Mr Johnson's Chief of Staff. Allies say his departure was amicable, but those unhappy with his role included the Prime Minister's fiancée, Carrie Simons. The man who ran number 10 for Theresa May says the Prime Minister now has a chance to get things back on track.
There's a big opportunity for him here, depending on the decisions that he now makes. But I think in terms of the Chief of Staff role, the key thing that I would say is that the most important word in the job title is staff, not chief. You're there not to try and deliver your own political agenda, your own views about what should happen to the country, but to make the government machine work for the Prime Minister.
And there are big decisions to be made. The government has to decide in the next couple of weeks whether to sign up to a trade agreement with Europe and what happens when the lockdown in England ends on the 2nd of December. Ultimately, those decisions are for the Prime Minister, not for his aides. But after the departures of recent days, some Tories are hoping the process might be a lot smoother. Rita.
Nick, many thanks. Nick Eardley there. The latest government figures show that there were 26,860 new coronavirus infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. That means that the average number of new cases reported per day in the last week is now 24,702. 1,617 people have been admitted to hospital on average each day over the week to last Tuesday. And 462 deaths were reported. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. It means on average in the past week, 411 deaths were announced every day. It takes the total number of deaths so far across the UK to 51,766. The government's decision to extend the furlough scheme and to increase help for the self-employed has brought relief to millions of workers. But many others are still falling through the gaps. It's thought that 2.9 million people, from freelancers and contractors to small business owners, are still excluded in some way from the Chancellor's income support schemes. Rishi Sunak says he's doing all he can. But as Emma Simpson now reports, the financial pressure is building for those who've missed out.
98% of our earnings have gone.
The rug was pulled from under our feet.
Now it's sleepless nights.
Ian and Lindsay run a successful corporate catering business.
This is the roasted turkey.
They should be flat out right now. Instead, they're not sure if any of these dishes will be made. Ian's a limited company director, so they're only entitled to £480 each a month on furlough. They've been using savings set aside for tax bills and a bounce-back loan to keep going.
It's not going to last forever, and
there'll come a point in time, obviously, when there'll
be no money.
There'll be nothing.
Empty.
And the pot sense, and we'll have nowhere to, we've got nowhere to hide then.
And then it doesn't make sense why we kept our staff on if the business goes under. Because why support businesses by giving staff furlough, keeping them employed, only for them to lose their job because the business wasn't supported in the first place?
They want the Chancellor to give them the same support as everyone else.
And I'd like to beg him, if necessary, to help those that need it, because at the moment people are suicidal.
Ian and Lindsay feel as if they're on borrowed time, but for others, the timer's already run out. Some have lost everything they've worked for because they've fallen between the cracks.
At the beginning of the lockdown in March, it was really about getting support out quickly to those who needed it. And there wasn't much time for the government to think about how best to target support. But now that the support packages have been extended once again, the government should be thinking about how best to target support to those who need it.
There's always a cast of thousands at the end of a blockbuster movie. Many of them are self-employed, like Louise Burton. But this contract ruled her out for self-employment job support.
Oh, I just don't want to this for a while. I pay tax. Why shouldn't I be eligible for any kind of support? It makes me furious. And, my mental health has been suffering because of this crisis. I know self-employment is hard and I know the industry is hard, but you never expect to be left out quite like this.
The Treasury says it's delivered one of the most comprehensive packages of support in the world. But 8 months on, the pressure's increasing to do more to help the millions who've missed out. Emma Simpson, BBC News.
Now, with all the sport, here's Ollie Foster at the BBC Sports Centre. Ollie.
Thank you, Rita. We've had 2 more matches in Rugby Union's new Autumn Nations Cup. Scotland had a scare in Italy, but won 28-17. It was far more straightforward for England. 40-0 winners against Georgia at Twickenham. Ben Croucher reports.
Rugby at Twickenham in 2020 looks a bit different. England are playing in blue for starters. The kits and players may change, the form has stayed constant, with Jack Willis on debut opening his international account for the Six Nations champions. It's a competition Georgia harbour hopes of joining, but 3 more first-half tries demonstrated the gulf between them. They knew what was coming too. It didn't mean they could do anything about it. Jamie George had already scored 2 tries like this when he became the first English hooker to score a hat-trick. The close-range tactic worked for Dan Robson too, as George's first visit to Twickenham was a pointless one. There's been a change in the air in Scottish sport of late. Their male footballers are on a roll and the rugby counterparts are on their best run this century. It was a tepid start in Tuscany though, as Italy found some Florence flair to lead at half-time. Scotland needed something a bit different to turn in their favour. Xander Fagerson, a former chorister and mountain biker turned prop forward, found his path to the Italian try line similarly unique. Scotland ecstatic, Italy just static. And even when they weren't, there was no stopping Scott Cummings from his power trip to the try line. A tried and trusted method when George Turner bundled over to complete a record-equalling 5th straight win. Ben Croucher, BBC News.
There was a huge upset in the Rugby Championship. Argentina beat New Zealand for the first time in their history. Fly half Nicolas Sanchez scored all their points as they stunned the All Blacks 25-15 in Sydney. The result was all the more remarkable because it was the Pumas' first match in over a year. The Women's Six Nations champions England have gone 1-0 up in their Test series against France. They won 33-10 in Grenoble. Jess Breach scored one of their 3 tries. The 2 sides meet again at Twickenham next Saturday. A very wet qualifying session didn't suit Lewis Hamilton ahead of tomorrow's Turkish Grand Prix. He'll start from 6th on the grid in Istanbul, but he was still faster than his Mercedes teammate Valtteri Bottas, his only championship rival. And if he finishes ahead of him tomorrow, he'll clinch a record-equalling 7th world title. The Canadian Lance Stroll took a surprise maiden pole position. Dustin Johnson has just gone 2 shots clear at the top of the leaderboard at the US Masters. Bad weather at Augusta has disrupted the final major of the year. John Rahm, the Spaniard, had to complete his 2nd round this morning. He missed that putt to take the outright lead. The 3rd round is now well underway. You can follow the Masters on the BBC Sport website and also check on all the results and watch the goals from the Women's Super League. Rita.
Ollie, many thanks. Hundreds of millions of people around the world are celebrating Diwali, the Hindu festival of lights. Coronavirus restrictions have limited celebrations, but there have still been some spectacular displays, including this one in the Indian city of Ayodhya. 584,572 lamps were lit, a new world record. And to anyone celebrating, happy Diwali. We are back with the late news at 10. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Bye-bye.